SCP-682 versus a ton of liquid nitrogen. After trying and failing to kill SCP-682 via anomalous means, Dr. Carlson wished to return to basics and try some non-anomalous murder methods for bringing an end to this nasty lizard. The 682 tissue sample was successful. It was frozen and shattered when struck with a hammer, exactly as intended. However, when 682 proper was doused with liquid nitrogen, its body remained frozen and dormant for about 10 minutes. Then it began increasing its body temperature until it was thawed, but it didn't stop there. It kept increasing its body temperature until it was so hot that the walls of the containment chamber began to melt. Dr. Carlson noted, interesting. It retained the adaptation even after it was no longer necessary. Maybe we should be more careful. SCP-682 versus SCP-294. The hard-to-destroy reptile versus the coffee machine. Could this supernatural Keurig brew up a final victory over this ordinary reptile? Researchers got the machine to dispense SCP-682 Killer and poured it onto a tissue sample. The sample crumbled into a fine powder when it made contact with the liquid, so they cumulatively brewed up a liter of the stuff and poured it on the actual SCP-682. The affected areas decayed and crumbled just like in the test, and when SCP-682 was placed back into its acid tank, the areas completely dissolved. The researchers felt incredibly hopeful, believing that if a large enough quantity of SCP-682 Killer can be synthesized, it may actually live up to its name. We'll let you know as soon as they try it again with a Venti order. SCP-682 versus SCP-923. Can this terrifying mind-melting satellite finally drive SCP-682 off the edge? Foundation researchers damaged SCP-682 heavily and took it out to an isolated field in Kansas in order to find out. SCP-923 fired down at 682 with its beam set to intensity level 75, known to have devastating effects against the minds of its victims. When the blast was unleashed, 682 began screaming and howling obscenities at the sky and the Foundation. Then its body began to adapt, growing glowing nodes that fired out its own beams similar to SCP-923's blasts, driving the observing Foundation employees completely insane. The test was considered such a failure that one of the lead researchers on the SCP-682 termination project threatened to do something redacted to whoever organized it. SCP-682 versus extremely high temperatures. Could the monstrous hard-to-destroy reptile finally be roasted to death in a superheated room? The researchers at the SCP Foundation hope so. They locked it in a special chamber and increased the temperature to truly immense proportions. But rather than melting, as the researchers had hoped, it developed a carapace of solid helium, which defended it from the heat. Even worse was that the carapace remained in place, even as the room was reduced back to safe temperatures. When personnel were sent in to inspect the creature, the carapace abruptly shattered and exploded all over the room, shredding everyone nearby. 682 had baited its victims inside and gotten a little payback for the extreme sauna session. SCP-682 versus SCP-3922. Who would win in this matchup between the indestructible reptile and the TV reality filter? 3922 is a small cylinder that, when placed near a television, will alter the content of any fictional material being played to include a battalion of heavily armed soldiers who proceed to arrest the characters in the film and try them for their crimes. The Foundation introduced 3922 to security footage of 682. The tape was then altered into a 72-hour military epic in which a coalition of soldiers, all played by deceased actors, attempted to terminate 682 over the course of the film. The film ends with the final remaining soldier, played by Patrick Swayze, alongside several gigantic primates staring down 682 and preparing to duke it out once and for all before a to-be-continued title card is displayed. Talk about a sequel hook. SCP-682 versus SCP-117. The hard-to-destroy reptile versus the perfect multi-tool. But can this ultra-convenient and somewhat vampiric gadget finally MacGyver this nasty lizard out of existence? The Foundation started with a sample test, using tissue extracted from 682's back and a D-class in charge of holding the multi-tool. The test looked promising. 117 produced a number of pneumatic hammers and pounded the 682 tissue sample into a fine slurry, then disintegrated the slurry into nothingness with particle beam weaponry, leaving the D-class it was being handled by with an almost deadly mineral deficiency. However, as you can probably guess, the test against the whole 682 lizard wasn't so successful. Rather than attacking 682, 117 produced a device that teleported itself and the D-class using it away, killing the D-class in the process. Test failed. SCP-682 vs. SCP-170. Can the ultimate molecular superglue pin the hard-to-destroy reptile down for good? The SCP-170 glue was laced onto a series of metal chains with the hope of confining rather than executing the monster. The tissue sample was promising, and things proceeded from there. 682 was sedated and wrapped with chains which were then connected to the ground. Initially, when 682 woke up, it thrashed around and tried to escape. However, its attempts were futile. But before researchers could start patting themselves on the back, 682 began to grow, until it reached such a size that the chains simply popped off. The leading theory as to how this worked wasn't that it hadn't technically grown, but increased the distance between its particles, shattering the molecular bond created by SCP-170. SCP-682 vs. SCP-049. The hard-to-destroy reptile is certainly a pretty pestilent creature, but would the mild-mannered plague doctor be able to cure our world of its presence? SCP-049 slowly approached the creature, seeming equal parts fascinated and frightened. It murmured, "The disease appears to not affect only humans," to itself. It closed in to get a better look and tried to grab 682, but the reptile immediately growled and swiped at 049. The doctor narrowly dodged taking any real damage, but the experience shook him. He seemed panicked and a little emotionally disturbed. At his own request, he was escorted back to his containment chamber. Poor guy. SCP-682 vs. SCP-2855. They say that money makes the world go round, but can Mr. Money put the reptile underground? SCP-2855, or Mr. Money, is part of Dr. Wondertainment's Little Misters series. His ability is having whatever capabilities his buyer believes he has, so he was sold to a member of the O5 Council as a man who can permanently destroy SCP-682, and will do so immediately upon completion of this transaction. However, this didn't happen. Instead, he disappeared for an hour, during which time SCP-682 seemed to show no ill effects. He later reappeared next to the council member, dazed and experiencing memory loss, with a note that read, "Oops! Dr. Wondertainment offers the sincerest of apologies for this unanticipated malfunction of your Mr. Money TM. We will be working to correct this error in future products. Goodbye." SCP-682 vs. SCP-093. Our dimension can't seem to keep the hard-to-destroy reptile down, but maybe the dimension that SCP-093, the Red Sea object, offers us access to across the mirror plane might have better luck. The object passed around SCP-682 until it turned green and affixed itself to a nearby mirror, purposefully selected to be big enough to allow SCP-682 through. When it refused to enter, the mirror was brought over, 682 was pushed in, and then the mirror was shattered. However, later on, the mirror anomalously put itself back together and SCP-682 was pushed back out. Because, of course he was. SCP-682 commented of his time on the other side,
"I am not very amused."
SCP-682 vs. SCP-5871. Could the knife that retroactively erases its victims from the timeline finally remove the hard-to-destroy reptile from our past, present, and future? SCP-682 was bound in place by restraints to prevent it from escaping, and a researcher using SCP-5871 slashed it, erasing it from existence. From that point on, a CK-class reality restructuring event occurred, and post-restructure researchers were unable to find any traces of SCP-682. It seemed almost like it never existed. However, soon after this, the effects were reversed by SCP-682's adapting abilities. 682 returned to reality, then the test we just described was erased from existence, as well as SCP-5871. SCP-682 vs. SCP-101. Could the Hungry Bag finally be the anomaly that doesn't find the hard-to-destroy reptile too tough to swallow? SCP-101, the Hungry Bag, is a small tooth-lined bag, seemingly connected to a limitless pocket dimension, capable of devouring almost anything. Dr. Leroy Carlson suggested it might be perfect to finish off 682 after it was reduced in size by another anomaly. So after SCP-682 was shrunk down by a confrontation with SCP-165-1, its tiny body was thrown into the gaping maw of SCP-101 and swallowed up. Later, however, SCP-101 began to gurgle for an extended period. After a prolonged period of discomfort, it belched up the tiny SCP-682, which later returned to its normal size. SCP-682 vs. SCP-3042. Could the ultimate case of puppy love be the force to counteract SCP-682's reptilian hatred? Let's take a look and see. SCP-3042 is a small but superpowered dog that bonds with one individual at a time, and basically gradually loves them to death with constant and unyielding affection. Its latest favorite person was eaten by SCP-682, causing SCP-3042 to imprint on the monster as a replacement. However, this was disastrous, as SCP-682 immediately attacked the tiny dog, causing it to run away in fear. SCP-3042 charged through a nearby wall, thankfully making a hole too small for SCP-682 to escape through, and imprinted on a nearby guard. Another test failed. SCP-682 vs. SCP-407. Could the Song of Genesis alter the hard-to-destroy reptile out of existence, finally making it true music to the SCP Foundation's ears? At 25 seconds, 682 did not seem at all soothed by the music. At 45 seconds, the creature's wounds from a previous test healed rapidly, and it made a high-pitched noise. At 1 minute 25 seconds, 682 screamed, and its mouth began to fill with a white foamy substance. At 1 minute 55 seconds, it swallowed this same substance and started choking. However, at 2 minutes 35 seconds, it squirted all the substance out of its mouth in a powerful jet. And at 3 minutes 55 seconds, 682 remained unconscious for 5 minutes to heal, and then awoke, utterly unaffected by the Song of Genesis. SCP-682 vs. SCP-165. Could the hard-to-destroy reptile finally be devoured by the combined forces of the creeping, hungry sands of Thule? A large SCP-165 sample was placed beneath a trapdoor, with SCP-682 positioned above it. When the monster was dropped into the hill of teeming flesh-eating mites, they began devouring it. It was engulfed in the dunes and remained there for 10 minutes, before the dunes ceased activity, and a much smaller version of SCP-682 crawled out. The Fire Eaters were called in to blast both and returned 682 to its containment chamber. In all likelihood, 682 had emitted a pesticide that killed off the mites, while a smaller version of itself hid inside its own skull, until it was safe to emerge and attempt escape. SCP-682 vs. SCP-067. While this particular cross-test was never expected to destroy or even harm the hard-to-destroy reptile, researchers figured that this all-telling fountain pen might glean valuable information about the monster. SCP-067 is a pen that causes people to compulsively write or draw about themselves. When the pen was given to SCP-682, it was horribly surprised when it began drawing a complex image on the floor. When the image was done, it threw the pen across the room. The resulting picture was a self-portrait of SCP-682, sitting atop a legion of dead Roman soldiers, marked as the 9th Legion, which had historically mysteriously disappeared. They may have been no closer to defeating SCP-682, but at least they solved that mystery. SCP-682 vs. SCP-1437. Could dropping 682 in a hole to another place finally get rid of it for good? To begin the test, 682 was thrown into 1437. At 1 hour 3 minutes 23 seconds, SCP-682 was expelled from 1437 in the shape of a large glass object, filled with a red, blood-like liquid. An on-site bulldozer pushed it back down the hole. At 13 hours 12 minutes 7 seconds, SCP-682 was expelled from the hole again in the form of a round mechanical device that released a dangerous gas and had a mouth full of gold teeth. The bulldozer pushed it back down. At 27 hours 20 minutes, SCP-682 was propelled out of 1437. It had returned to its original shape, with the exception of a larger body, shorter snout, and a variety of weapons embedded in its body. SCP-682 vs. SCP-938. Can this electrical entity provide an adequate shock to 682's system? SCP-682 was placed in a containment chamber attached to Site-7. An electric device was brought into the room and routed into SCP-938. The device increased in electrical voltage to the point that it damaged SCP-682, causing burns to its body and paralyzing it for 1 hour. At this point, it regained motion capabilities and shot electricity from its spine through its head. Then it lost consciousness, though it was still breathing, and remained that way for several days as its body recovered. Not quite as electrifying as the Foundation had hoped, so it appeared. The researcher for this test, Dr. Carley, did at least note that electrical or mind-based SCPs did tend to keep SCP-682 immobilized longer than physical or chemical attacks. SCP-682 vs. SCP-858. Could Could gravity's rainbow finally clear the dark cloud of the unkillable reptile and bring sunny skies to the SCP Foundation? A tissue sample from 682, repelled from Earth's gravity at a speed of 9.8 meters per second, was destroyed by SCP-858. When SCP-682 was exposed to 858, it began to fall away from the Earth's surface at the same rate as the sample. It reached 858, but it did not disappear. It hit some sort of invisible barrier, and its body appeared to be slowly boiling. This continued until the reptile had lost 50% of its body mass. When half of its body was gone, 682 suddenly sprouted a pair of wings similar to those of Petriosaurs, in addition to an array of air bladders that allowed it to fly perpendicular to SCP-858's gravity. SCP-682 versus SCP-539. Could the perfect distraction take 682's attention away from the one thing it cares about? Hatred? A member of D-Class personnel was sent into SCP-682's containment chamber, carrying SCP-539. Then the doors were shut behind them. Terrified that SCP-682 would kill them, the D-Class threw SCP-539 early in an attempt to distract it. As soon as SCP-539 was thrown, the site experienced a system malfunction in the containment chamber. An acid pump was activated during this malfunction, trapping SCP-682 for approximately 20 minutes before it was deactivated by site maintenance staff. By the time staff reached the containment chamber, 85% of 682's body had been destroyed. SCP-539 was found nearby, and the D-Class was completely gone. 3 hours later, SCP-682 was completely recovered, plus an additional pair of legs grown during the healing process.